Hello there, and welcome to my YouTube vlog for Friday, January 4th, 2013. Well, today I actually have a question for you out there in YouTube. How many of you in your childhood have had imaginary friends? And how many of you had them for quite a longer time than people suspected? Say until you were around 10, 11 years old. I suppose everybody has different reasons. Some people find that some of the folks around them they don't get along with too well, and like in my case, some of the imaginary friends, they weren't animals or cartoons or fantasy characters. They were people who were more like me and more accepting, and somebody I could just nod to and have an understanding with, except they didn't exist, and I knew they didn't. But people also channel their imaginary friends in many different ways. And I know that now that Christmas vacation is over, the kids are going back to school, and because today is so politically correct in a lot of ways, and has been for quite some time, they may be facing issues with imaginary friends, especially if they're in that 10, 11-year-old age group. A lot of people might still think they're and prescribe medication for them. Well, the other day I was talking online, and the story came into my head. You know how sometimes you're just doing something random and all of a sudden you have a flood of memories of one specific kind of event that just floors you, and you realize, oh my goodness, that was such an important thing that happened. How could I ever have forgotten that? Well, it happened to me. I was talking about the issue of imaginary friends, and I remembered what happened was that I was in the 4th grade, and we had a creative writing class, or a creative writing course, or whatever, and they would actually give us a piece of paper, and it was about, a page long, and it had a small synopsis. And we were asked to take that synopsis and create a short story out of it, specifically to use vocabulary words, spelling, grammar, spacing paragraphs properly, and all of that. But story construction was actually very important too. So we were asked to do all of these things. And we all get different stories. They were not any kind of copy pasta sort of situation. They were all quite different. And the story I always remembered, it was a synopsis about a girl, and there was a picture next to it, a little black and white cartoon about a girl named Pun, P-U-N. And she was building a soapbox racer. And that was about the end of the synopsis. And I was thinking about it. There's always a lot of distractions in school. But when I thought about it, the first thing that came into my head was that, in my 10, 11-year-old mind, how could I make the story more provocative? Make the characters more interesting and more concerned about the world around them, and make the reader more interested. The creative juices really started going, and I suppose I neglected some of my homework that week writing this story. But it didn't matter. This was very important. And the story that happened was this. Pun became this young girl about my age who was an outcast because she liked things like soapbox racers and auto shop and wood shop that traditionally young boys were supposed to like. I don't know if she was necessarily a tomboy. I don't know if I was necessarily reading that into it. But she was an outcast. And she had this neighbor who found out about her soapbox racer and started to help her with it. Okay? And remember, I was really into science fiction at that time, still am. And in the end, she wondered why this man, who could have been her uncle or whatever, showed so much interest in her. And he explained to her that he was not from this planet, that he was living here, and he wanted to enrich the lives of young Earth people. Anyway, I think in the end she went off and had this soapbox race, and I think she won. I thought it was a heartwarming, happy story with a sci-fi twist. I suppose would have worked really well in Doctor Who, or something like that. It actually had that kind of flavor to it. So I submitted it to my teachers. And there were always counselors coming in and out of the classroom in those days. So they were saying things like, well, at least these counselors were. They were saying things like, I'm a little bit concerned that you have a young girl who is given so much attention by an adult man. Why did you write that? Couldn't you have written it differently? And, I was not an idiot. I knew what this was implying. There were implications that this was politically incorrect, that it had overtones of possibly some sort of child abuse. I don't know, but I could get this. And I remember at that time I was a bit timid, but for some reason, after writing the story, I said, I can't change my story. I worked hard on this. I neglected some of my other studies because of this story. I feel this story is important and there's a message here for everybody, or something to that effect. So I said, okay, we'll let this go. And they had already had issues with me having imaginary friends that I wrote about anyway. So we all read these stories out in class. So I read this story about this girl and the soapbox racer, and everybody kind of looked at me dumbfounded and lightly clapped. Yay! No big deal. So I said, okay, well, it went over decently. And then after that, I heard the other stories, and they met with varying responses, except one I noticed. Somebody got a story about football, I guess. And the story was, in their case, another young boy wrote this, that there was a football player and he was trying to compete against an opposing team. And in the end, the whole moral of his story, okay, was that he had this issue with literally knocking the members of the opposing team out and drawing blood and maybe breaking some of their teeth. And that this was somehow supposed to deal with the thrill of victory and being able to deal with himself in a competitive fashion. So basically, he won by hurting somebody. And everybody was, yay! And they were cheering, and everybody was very happy, and they were praising the grammar and all of this. And my first thought was, this is absolutely sick. I wrote a very heartwarming story, and it was thought of to be politically incorrect. And this other one wrote a story about physically knocking another person's brains out, being a bully because of sports, and he was praised. Now, looking back on it, as I think about it, this was during Operation Desert Storm. You all remember that? Storm and Norman, Colin Powell, Saddam Hussein, all of this. I mean, everybody was in a yellow ribbon, let's go out and fight everybody, and fighting is cool kind of mindset. And that my first thought at that time was, I wish I had the funds to transfer to a private school. This is nuts. This is nonsense. And I have to admit, ever since then, I've always doubted my creative abilities just a little bit more than I should. I wouldn't say I have low self-esteem, but I don't think the stories that I have to tell, whether through art or photography or any medium, even creative writing, are something that anybody really wants to hear because it interests me primarily. I have plenty of confidence in my own work. I had confidence in that paper. But this is something I wanted to tell everybody. I'm sure stories like that are still happening today. In fact, I know they're happening today. And while mine was handled relatively well and I got out unscathed, I know a lot of children aren't. And I think that it's important that we learn to be a little bit more creative in the way that we handle our children. I think that children's creativity needs to be nurtured. I don't think that the education system should be programming them to be robots to basically work in a very clinical job market. I think imagination, I think the creativity, I think that all of these things should be encouraged because industriousness and real imaginative thinking and the civilization we know now, whether it be the Statue of Liberty, the Empire State Building, or whatever, all come from that kind of imagination. Okay? We need it, and we need to encourage it. And if it's not encouraged, we need to learn to encourage ourselves. Children, adults, everybody, because that's very important. Encouraging creativity is probably the key to changing the world. And that story, I think, puts it much better than any abbreviated way I could put it. So, you know, if you have an imaginary friend and somebody says, oh, you shouldn't have it, you're a little too old, you know, use it in a story. Create with it. Create a character. You might write a book someday. You know, don't let anybody get you down. You know, they might try. They might try very hard. But don't let it happen. Always remember, mind's a horrible thing to waste. The imagination is a horrible thing to lose. A horrible thing to lose. Don't lose it. Keep it in your mind. Whether you're in first grade or college or you're an untraditional student, it's very important. And that's my message that I want to give you for the day. This is Andre saying, see you next time on YouTube. Thank you.